Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello, this is Czechast, your podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, and my guest today has a deeply personal connection to this country. Michaela Küchler is the Secretary General of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA, but her ties to Czechia go back generations. Her grandparents lived here after the war until one day her grandfather was speaking German to his wife on a Prague street.
My grandfather spoke fluent Czech. My grandmother didn't. And my grandfather got slapped in the street in Prague when he spoke German with his wife. And that's when he said, we're going to leave. And they went also to Bavaria. And that's where my parents met in 1959.
The family eventually settled in Bavaria, but Czechia never left their hearts. Michaela's father brought her back often, nurturing her love for the country.
Well, my father, he loved Czechoslovakia and he loved Czechia. And we went so often to Prague as we were children or young adults. And he planted actually that love for the country into my heart, and it fell on fertile ground.
But what is the main subject of this episode? Today, she works to preserve the memory of some of the most painful chapters in Czech and European history, including the genocide of Roma and Sinti people during the Holocaust. One of the most notorious sites was the concentration camp at Lety.
It's in the Czech Republic, and it was an internment camp for Roma and Sinti people in occupied Bohemia. There were about 1,300 people who passed through the Lety camp at some point, and out of these about 335 people died on site, and more than 500 were transported to Auschwitz, many of whom died during the transport or at the camp.
And we are talking now because the 2nd of August is the International Day of Remembrance for the Roma and Sinti Holocaust. So stay with us.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
Both of my parents were born in Czechoslovakia at the time. My mother near Sokolov and my father in Ústí nad Labem. And my father was raised in Prague and attended Czech schools and was fluent in Czech. And from 1962 onwards, we visited Prague, mainly Prague, but also the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, quite frequently. Also before and after Prague Spring, which was I was 9 years old back then. And I would say it's the first political memory I have about this visit after the Prague Spring. And it impressed me a lot. And then I became a career diplomat in 1988. And from 1990 to 1994, I was posted in Prague in the beautiful Lobkowicz Palais. And it was really a fascinating time to be in Prague during that period.
If I may just dwell a little bit on this kind of aspect of your life. Obviously, your parents were expelled from Czechoslovakia as about other 3 million people who were speaking German. Was there any bitterness on their side?
Well, from my mother's side, the family was expelled. She was 6 years old back then when they were expelled, and they were expelled to Bavaria, where I grew up. And I remember my grandmother always saying it was such a luck for Bavaria that we came to this country here because we turned it from an agrarian state into an industrial state. And my grandmother, she was not a very political figure, but she was proud of the contribution of the Sudeten Germans to to Bavaria. From my father's side, the history is different because my grandfather was Jewish and he was in Sachsenhausen. He was doing forced labor. He was also at the end from 1994, 1945 until liberation, incarcerated in Theresienstadt, Teresin. And they were not expelled because they were considered, well, all those who had been in the concentration camps and the ghettos were not expelled by Czechoslovakia.
So he left because we just didn't probably have many reasons to stay in Czechoslovakia.
My grandfather spoke fluent Czech. My grandmother didn't. And my grandfather got slapped in the street in Prague when he spoke German with his wife. And that's when he said, we're going to leave. And they went also to Bavaria. And that's where my parents met in 1959.
Let's move on. You've had a great diplomatic career. Let me just ask you briefly, with that experience that you brought, what do you think were the lessons that you learned as a diplomat and that you can now use in your position?
I met many different people from different nationalities, different levels of society, different languages. I think it taught me a lot about how similar we are, and about our common values, about how we should cooperate together to make this world a better place. It taught me a lot about tolerance. For instance, one of my first tasks in Prague was answering to a request from a German sex workers union. And they wanted to know about the situation of sex workers in Czechoslovakia back in 1990 or 1991. That was really a challenge because I never booked services of sex workers, and I never had any contact to that part of society. But it was interesting to learn about the challenges and so on. So first of all, I think working in diplomacy is a great privilege because it's a never-ending learning process. And it teaches you about the tolerance and about different approaches you may have towards how to approach a problem. And I had one multilateral experience from 1999 to 2004. I worked at the German mission to the European Union, where I was a German representative in the Enlargement Union, which again was a connection to the Czech Republic, because the Czech Republic was negotiating then their accession to the European Union. And that sort of multilateral experience is very useful in my current job, because the IRA is International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, is an international organization with 35 member states globally, from Australia to Argentina, from the United States and Canada to the Baltic countries, including Israel, and Western Balkan countries. So that's a very valuable experience, which I bring from my diplomatic career into the current job.
So let me dwell just a little bit on your experience from the early 1990s, and this will actually gradually get us to the main point of our discussion today, because I remember the early 1990s when I was a young adult, new on the work market. President Václav Havel was in Prague. We had the Prime Minister Václav Klaus at that period of time. And the Czech society started to deal with some of the painful questions in its history, including the expulsion of the German-speaking population, but also with the Czech role in, for example, as we will get to that, with the Roma concentration camp in Lety as well, gradually. What was it like for you? Did you follow that discussion within the Czech society? Were you aware of that as a diplomat, or was it something that was just out of your work scope?
Well, I was aware of the discussion around the Beneš decrees, but I'm not so sure if my memory is correct. But I don't think that I was aware back then about the camp in Lety. But when I served from 2018 to 2022 as German ambassador for Holocaust Remembrance and head of the German delegation to the IRA, of course, I became aware of the of the problematic of the Lety camp. I was back then working at the German Federal Foreign Office as ambassador for Holocaust Remembrance, and we were in constant discussions with the people taking care of the camp and what was going to be made out of it in order to be able to support in a way or another the installation of a memorial site at the camp. And coming back to the discussion, I think the Velvet Revolution and the development of Czechia into a democratic state of law made this whole discussion possible. Before, it would not have been possible, I think. So it took a long time, but I think what has come out of it is very good. And I think it is also very good to face one's past, because that will help to pave the way into the future.
I don't want you to do my work, but let me still ask you, if you were to describe to the listeners who are perhaps not aware what the Lety concentration camp was like, what sort of institution was it? And if we can try to put it at least kind of as a kind of introduction into the whole context of Holocaust in this part of Europe.
Lety u Písku, it's in the Czech Republic, and it was an internment camp for Roma and Sinti people in occupied Bohemia. There were about 1,300 people who passed through the Lety camp at some point, and out of these, about 335 people died on site, and more than 500 were transported to Auschwitz, many of whom died during the transport or at the camp. Very few Czech Roma survived the war. The interesting thing about Lety is that the pre-German occupation Czechoslovak government mandated the establishment of a forced labor camp for Roma. But only under the German-administered protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, this camp was founded outside the village of Lety in 1940. And in August 1942, Lety was designated as an internment camp for Roma in Bohemia as the so-called gypsy camp. Roma prisoners there were forced to work in and around the camp, and many, especially children and the elderly, died from disease and malnutrition. Most surviving prisoners were eventually transported to Auschwitz, where almost all of them were murdered. The camp buildings were destroyed and burned down, and the camp was abandoned in August 1943.
So just to make sure that the listeners understand, even though this was a camp in the protectorate of Böhmen und Mähren, which was ruled obviously by the Nazis, the camp itself was Czech administered and it had a Czech personnel. Now, for decades, there was a pig farm on that site of this place where such horrible things happened. The pig farm was actually built in the 1970s. And then there was a very long and painful debate what should be done with that. Because obviously there was an owner of that pig farm, and it was quite a big one. It was a big complex. Eventually the Czech state bought it. I was able, as a Czech citizen, just follow the debate in the media because it literally took years. What do you think it says about the ability, and I'm not now asking, particularly about Czechia, about the societies in Central Europe to deal with this kind of, again, painful heritage?
Well, the fact that it took so long to, actually almost 60 years or so, to recognize what had happened there and to turn it into a dignified site, into a dignified memorial site, means that the history of persecution of the Roma and Sinti in Europe has for a long period been neglected. Very few people still today know about the Holocaust, know about the genocide of the Sinti and Roma, let alone that it is part of any curricula in schools in European countries or in countries who belong to the IRA constituency outside Europe. So but people know about the Holocaust. It is being taught in schools. There are memorial sites. There is a Holocaust Remembrance Day, which in Germany was established in 1996 and United Nations levels in 2006. But there had been no such thing about Roma remembrance in Europe. So I think it tells a story of neglect.
In the context where many people know, of course, about Auschwitz, for example, in Poland, but as you mentioned, far fewer will know about the genocide of Roma. I just wonder what it says about why this part of the story was neglected. If you perhaps have some discussions on that in IRA, and is that perhaps something that you want to obviously change now?
I think part of the explanation is that even post-war, the stigma that surrounded the Roma pre-war persisted. So after the war, the Roma continued to be discriminated against. They were excluded from post-war justice and excluded from remembrance efforts. I know of Roma survivors who, until their dying day, did not have their suffering recognized or receive any compensation. So I would like to share the story of Zdeněk Růžička of the Committee for the Redress of the Roma Holocaust. Zdeněk Růžička was a Czech Roma and the son of a survivor. Růžička had been advocating for the removal of the pig farm for decades. And one day he took an IRA delegation to the nearby cemetery where adults and children from the camp that died from malnutrition and also from a typhus epidemic, including Mr. Růžička's sister, are buried. I mean, just imagine going to that place where your mother suffered, where your sister lies buried, and seeing a pig farm. Růžička asked the IRA delegation to find a solution for the removal of the pigs, and the then IRA chair, Ambassador Mihnea Constantinescu, IRA experts, and the many active national Roma organizations worked to make it a reality. The last pigs were removed in March 2018. Zdeněk died, very young still, in December 2022. He never lived to see the beautiful memorial opened at Lety, but he was part of the jury that selected the memorial which would build it. He knew that the suffering of his mother, the life of his sister were not forgotten. And there's even a statue at Lety to remember him.
You are listening to Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, and my guest is Michaela Küchler, Secretary General of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance.
Do you see now in your position at IRA that the governments are responding, not just perhaps of the member states, but other countries?
Yes, I see that there is a growing awareness of the Roma genocide in the countries which belong to IRA. In 2020, the IRA adopted a working definition of anti-Gypsyism, anti-Roma discrimination, and all 35 member states of the IRA have subscribed to that definition. In Germany, it's the basis for a strategy to remove discrimination of Roma. So there is movement, and for instance, this year, under the Israeli chairmanship of the IRA, under the Israeli presidency of the IRA, a Roma conference will be held by Israel in cooperation with the Czech Foreign Ministry on Roma, on the genocide of the Sinti and the Roma in the Černín Palace in Prague.
And when is this going to happen? I'm sorry.
This will be on the 23rd of October, and a visit to Lety will be included on the 22nd of October.
Thank you very much for that information. I'm really glad that I learned that directly from you. IRA adopted the working definition of anti-Roma discrimination. If you were again to explain why such a definition is needed now, and what are the practical impacts it might have?
Post-war, Roma are still being discriminated against, and this discrimination hasn't ended until today. They have lesser chances in education. They have lesser chances to make a career. So they are still being discriminated against, and that is where the need arises to recognize the genocide of the Sinti and Roma, to research the genocide of the Sinti and Roma, and also to fight this discrimination. But you can only fight something when you know what it is, and that was the aim of the discrimination and of the definition, to show in which form this discrimination is being used against Roma.
Let me mention that I prepared a program in Czech for the Czech National Public Radio last year. It was a documentary of about half hour, where I was trying to find out whether something has changed in the Roma population situation in Ústí nad Labem, the place where your father came from, where there was a big debate about the so-called wall, or some called it fence, in Matiční Street back in 1999. So I came back 25 years later, and I'm sorry to say, very little has changed. I mean, when we talk about the situation of Roma people, I also traveled to Eastern Slovakia, where I saw some of the Roma villages. And I just wonder whether there is something positive, you might say, about that, because it was, in a way, I don't want to use the word depressing, but I just don't have an explanation for that. I was just trying to map out the situation. I wasn't trying to find solutions. I think that the debate about the Holocaust and Holocaust against Roma definitely is part of the picture, if not.
Yeah, of course, the genocide against Roma is part of the picture. Just imagine a society that will lose hundreds of thousands of its members. And I mean, every loss is something we must deplore, but every loss is also a loss of talent, of capacities, of contribution to society. So, and then being discriminated against just because of how you are born, in which family you are born, that's outrageous. So I fear that your experience is not so unusual, and there is still a very long way to go. Since I represent an international organization, but I'm German and I live in Germany, and the organization is placed in Germany, so I know a little bit about the situation of the German Roma. And the president of the Central Council of Sinti and Roma in Germany, Romani Rose, he understands his fight against discrimination as a fight for civil rights, like the fight for civil rights for Black people in the US. And you have to have a lot of patience and a lot of strength in order to be able to make that fight. But I think it's also a task for the majority in society to accept that the Roma are the largest minority in Europe. Their language or languages are being recognized in some countries as minority languages. I think there is really space to learn about what has happened to this minority during the Nazi era, what has happened afterwards, and to learn also about their culture, their art, their music, and their contribution to society. If you allow, I would like to mention the case of a German singer. She was very famous back in the 1970s and 1980s, Marianne Rosenberg. She came from a family of musicians, and it turned out, I think it was almost towards the end of her career, but she had a forced coming out, so to say. Someone asked her if it was true that her father or her grandfather had been in a concentration camp, had been persecuted for being a Sinto. And she said, yes, that's true. So it turned out she is a Sintitsa, and she had always hidden that because she was fearing discrimination. In reality, she brought so much joy to the people who liked her songs. And I think this is something we also have to learn.
If I could turn the page a little bit. You have warned about the global rise of Holocaust distortion. If you were to explain again to the listeners, what exactly are we talking about and how does it fit into the general trend of at least perceived rise in hate speech, which is obviously helped by using of social media, etc.?
Yeah. Well, Holocaust distortion, maybe to give you some examples. So people say distort the Holocaust by doubting the number of those who were killed during the Holocaust, especially by doubting the number of Jews who were killed, or by comparing the Holocaust to phenomena which have nothing to do with the Holocaust. So I think it was back in the 1980s or 90s when a PETA, it's an organization that deals with animal protection, when they spoke about animal Holocaust. Or during COVID, you could see people demonstrating against vaccination, wearing a yellow star on their sleeves in order to, we are being stigmatized because we don't want to be vaccinated. So all of that is distorting the Holocaust. And if you start manipulating the facts, if you start to question the facts, well, can always question, but if you start manipulating the facts, then this will erode public trust and it will feed conspiracy thinking. And it will also give way to forms of othering of different groups of society. So as Yehuda Bauer, one of the founders of the IRA, always said, the anti-Semitism starts with the Jews, but it does not end with the Jews. So it's anti-Semitism which opens the door to discrimination of all sorts of groups of the population, and that it's very dangerous for democracies to allow that sort of discrimination against so many groups of societies. And yes, and I mean, if you allow hate speech against one group, then hate speech will spread to other groups of societies. And I can only strongly recommend the teaching material that the IRA has developed in order to fight distortion. It's available online. It's free. You can download it. It's called Protect the Facts. Go on our website, find it, use it.
We are now speaking very close to the day when the world will remember Holocaust, the memory of Holocaust. Mm-hmm. There are so many international days these days. I'm sorry to say that, and I don't want to be cynical at all. But there's in a way, big competition. I mean, let's be realistic about it. What makes this day, particular? What makes this day special? And what would you, as an organization, want this day to help?
Well, the day is special. So the day we're talking about is the 2nd of August. That's the day to remember the genocide of the Sinti and Roma. And it is the event it is connected to was the liquidation of the so-called gypsy camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. So all the Roma who were still alive there were brought to the gas chambers and killed and burned. That's the 2nd of August. And what is special about this is that so few people know about it until today. And I hope that your program will contribute to make it more known. There will be a commemoration in Auschwitz. There will be one in Berlin. Probably there will be one in Prague. So it starts spreading, but it is still not enough. And what again was the second part of your question?
No, that's fine. That's okay. And I will need to reformulate the question as well a little bit. I haven't asked all the questions, but I would like to finish on this one. And then you will be able to say something if you feel the need. For someone who happens to be in Czechia and might be interested in the story of the Lety of concentration camp, even though he or she hears about it for the first time, what would you hope the people who come there take away from that experience, from that visit?
I'm very glad that the Muzeum Romskiej Kultury in Brno is taking care of it. And I'm really also glad that Anna Mišková from the Muzeum Romskiej Kultury, his Museum of Roma Culture in Brno, is dedicating so much of her time to the Lety Memorial Place. I would, first of all, like people to take away a sense of gratefulness for the ones who fought so long to make this happen, and to make, as far as I can tell from pictures I have seen, to make a beautiful and very dignified place out of it, out of a place which was neglected and even was sort of destroyed. I want people to understand that silence and neglect are never neutral, and above all, I want people to think about Zdeněk Růžička, of his mother and of his little sister. Zdeněk fought for decades. It is our turn now.
That was my conversation with Michaela Küchler, Secretary General of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So the story of Lety u Písku is not only about what happened during the war, it's also about what happened afterwards and how societies remember or sometimes fail to remember past injustice. If you'd like to hear more conversations about Czechia, its history and people, stay with Czechast. And while you're at it, check out Prague of the Beaten Track, my sister podcast exploring lesser-known parts of the Czech capital. And please remember to subscribe, follow and press that like button. It helps us bring you stories like these. I'm Vít Pohanka, thanks for listening, stay curious and naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.